During the Edo period of Japan, between the early 1600s and mid-1800s, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled with a strict and centralized form of government. The country was at peace after centuries of internal warfare, but that peace came at the cost of freedom and individuality. The shogun and his officials maintained rigid control over social order, crime, and public morality. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more chilling tales from history's darkest corners. Among these rulers was Tokugawa Yoshinori, a man remembered for his obsession with discipline and public conformity. Born into a lower branch of the Tokugawa family, Yoshinori rose to power through relentless ambition and calculated alliances. His rule began during a time when the shogunate sought to eliminate corruption and reinforce obedience among its citizens. Yoshinori viewed crime not only as a breach of law, but as a moral stain upon the nation. He believed that the fear of humiliation was a stronger deterrent than death itself. This philosophy guided the development of some of the most severe punishments in Edo Japan, including public executions, displays of bodies, and ritualized forms of torture. His rise coincided with a growing concern among officials about urban unrest in Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka. The expansion of merchant wealth, the rise of pleasure districts, and the influence of kabuki theater were seen as signs of moral decline. Yoshinori considered it his duty to restore traditional values rooted in Confucian ethics and Shinto loyalty. Unlike other rulers who relied on samurai enforcement alone, Yoshinori organized a network of informants and inspectors known as metsuke. They monitored commoners, merchants, and even minor samurai, ensuring that loyalty to the shogunate was absolute. Reports of misconduct or dissent were quickly escalated, and punishment followed swiftly. Under his rule, the Tokugawa legal system became more structured, but also more public. Punishments were not merely acts of justice, but public spectacles designed to educate. Executions took place in open spaces, where citizens were encouraged to watch and reflect on the consequences of moral failure. The concept of deterrence became deeply embedded in the legal philosophy of the era. Yoshinori believed that light and visibility symbolized truth and moral order. To him, crime thrived in darkness, secrecy, and shame. This idea later inspired a system of punishment where criminals were literally turned into sources of light during public ceremonies. The metaphor of illumination became both symbolic and terrifying. Before the development of these punishments, the shogunate relied on traditional methods such as beheading, crucifixion, and burning. However, Yoshinori sought punishments that could be used not only to execute, but also to instruct. He wanted them to serve a spiritual purpose, purging the sins of both the individual and the community through public suffering. His reign also saw the codification of sumptuary laws, which dictated dress, behavior, and social conduct according to class. Merchants were forbidden from wearing silk. Farmers could not leave their villages without permits. Even minor offenses such as speaking against an official or mocking a samurai could lead to imprisonment or public beating. The urban festivals of Edo, once joyous events celebrating harvests or deities, began to incorporate elements of discipline under Yoshinori's rule. He used these gatherings as opportunities to display moral authority. During these festivals, public announcements condemned criminal acts and reinforced the importance of virtue and loyalty to the shogunate. The idea of using festivals as platforms for punishment grew gradually. Yoshinori observed that people were more attentive when punishment was presented in a ceremonial context rather than a routine execution. He combined entertainment, ritual, and justice into a single social experience that reinforced state power. His advisors included scholars influenced by Neo-Confucian thought, who argued that visible order reflected inner morality. They taught that when citizens witnessed justice, they internalized virtue. Yoshinori adopted this reasoning and began to plan punishments that were not only physical but symbolic, aiming to cleanse society of corruption through public example. Records from Edo's magistrate offices show that Yoshinori's administration documented every punishment meticulously. Crimes ranging from theft to adultery were catalogued with their corresponding sentences. These records reveal a legal system that valued documentation as much as deterrence, reflecting the bureaucratic nature of the shogunate. Despite the harshness of his rule, Yoshinori was admired by many officials for maintaining stability. The country experienced low rates of rebellion, efficient tax collection, and economic consistency. Merchants thrived under regulation, and farmers benefited from standardized grain policies. Order was maintained through fear, but it ensured predictability in everyday life. Yoshinori also enforced strict control over religion and expression. Temples were required to register every household to prevent hidden Christians or political agitators. Buddhist priests often cooperated with authorities, preaching obedience to the shogunate as part of divine will. This unity between spiritual and political power strengthened the reach of Yoshinori's rule. Public punishment was not only for the condemned, but also for the community. Families of criminals were often forced to witness the execution of their relatives. In some cases, they were required to participate by offering prayers or apologies on behalf of the condemned. This collective responsibility created an atmosphere of shared guilt and control. The idea of light as purification began to merge with the notion of moral exposure. Festivals that once celebrated illumination, such as lantern festivals and fire ceremonies, became associated with confession and repentance. Yoshinori believed that fire revealed truth, and that the burning of criminals could symbolize the burning away of sin. Early accounts describe smaller-scale punishments, where offenders were forced to carry lanterns bearing their names, walking through the streets at night as a symbol of shame. These acts served as public confessions, allowing others to witness their repentance. Over time, the symbolism intensified, evolving from carrying light to becoming light. Yoshinori's fascination with symbolism influenced architecture, art, and literature during his reign. Paintings from the era depict order, obedience, and structured beauty. Streets were planned with precision, and night patrols ensured that citizens adhered to curfews. The city itself became a living image of discipline. However, within the court, whispers began to spread about the extremes of his governance. Some scholars questioned whether morality enforced through terror could truly sustain virtue. Yet Yoshinori dismissed these doubts, believing that only strict control could preserve the peace his ancestors fought to establish. Foreign influence during this time was heavily restricted under the Sakoku policy, which limited trade and contact with the outside world. This isolation strengthened internal control, but also prevented new ideas about human rights or punishment from reaching Japan. Yoshinori's vision remained untouched by outside moral frameworks. In his later years, Yoshinori's obsession with ritual and symbolism deepened. He began to see crime as a form of spiritual darkness that could only be illuminated through sacred fire. He commissioned scholars and priests to design punishments that merged theology and law, ensuring that execution was seen not only as justice but as moral restoration. The foundations for the practice later known as the Lantern Men were laid during this period. It emerged from a combination of Yoshinori's philosophical beliefs, religious symbolism, and the desire for visual deterrence. What began as symbolic acts of confession through light would soon evolve into one of the most brutal forms of punishment in Edo, Japan. By the end of his third decade in power, Yoshinori had transformed Edo into a city of order and obedience. Lanterns filled the streets during every festival, each one representing purity and repentance. Citizens lived under constant surveillance, aware that even a small act of defiance could draw the shogun's attention. To the people, light had become both sacred and terrifying. Under Yoshinori's reign, it symbolized purity, but it also foreshadowed the coming of fire that would soon consume those deemed impure by the state. The transformation of light from a symbol of celebration to a tool of punishment had quietly begun. During the later years of Tokugawa Yoshinori's rule, Edo became a city where morality and control merged into every aspect of life. The shogun's obsession with purity through punishment reached its height when he introduced a system known as the Lantern Men. This punishment combined fire, ritual, and spectacle into a single act of state-sanctioned repentance. The idea originated from earlier penitential parades where petty criminals carried oil lamps as a sign of remorse. Over time, Yoshinori expanded this concept into a full ritual execution. The condemned would no longer carry lanterns, they would become them. His court philosophers declared that light revealed the path to virtue, and through illumination, even sinners could serve the public good. The official record describes the practice as hai no kokuhaku, meaning confession by fire. It was introduced during the midsummer festival season when lanterns illuminated every temple and street. The shogunate announced the ritual as a sacred offering, claiming that the condemned would light the way for honest citizens during nights of celebration. Preparation for the ritual began days in advance. Artisans constructed large wooden poles at festival grounds, and officials built raised platforms for the audience. Oil merchants provided specially refined sesame and fish oil, chosen for its brightness and slow burn. Every element was carefully planned to ensure that the punishment appeared ceremonial rather than chaotic. Criminals selected for this punishment were not random offenders. The shogunate reserved it for those accused of repeated crimes, moral corruption, or public deceit, acts considered dangerous to social harmony. These individuals were often merchants found guilty of fraud, officials caught taking bribes, or entertainers accused of moral indecency. On the day of the ritual, the condemned were paraded through the city streets in wooden cages. Their faces were marked with ink symbols representing sin, greed, deceit, or lust, depending on the crime. Priests walked alongside, chanting sutras for purification, while soldiers maintained order. The procession ended at the central square, where the execution platform stood. Before ignition, each prisoner was coated in a mixture of oil and resin by appointed attendants. The mixture ensured that the flame would burn brightly, but not immediately consume the body. Witnesses noted that the smell of oil became a familiar sign of the ritual, lingering in the air even after the fire had gone out. A herald read the crimes aloud in front of the crowd. The message was clear: public shame was as important as physical punishment. Citizens were expected to learn from the sight, understanding that moral decay would lead to the same end. The condemned were bound to posts, their arms extended in a cruciform shape to maximize visibility. Once everything was ready, the high official in charge signaled for silence. A torchbearer, often a junior officer chosen for his loyalty, stepped forward and touched his flame to the oil-soaked garments. The fire spread quickly, illuminating the surroundings with a flickering golden glow. Witness accounts described the moment as both mesmerizing and horrifying. The flames danced in rhythmic waves, casting shadows that merged with the lanterns hanging around the square. To many onlookers, it seemed as though the condemned had become part of the festival illumination itself. The event blended punishment with celebration, creating a disturbing sense of normalcy. Priests continued to chant throughout the process. They recited verses of purification, claiming that the sinner's final cries were prayers ascending to the heavens. This spiritual framing allowed citizens to interpret the torture as both a moral warning and a religious act of cleansing. The shogunate's officials documented each execution in detail. Records included the names of the condemned, their crimes, the duration of burning, and the reaction of the crowd. These records show that the ritual often lasted between 10 and 20 minutes, depending on how much oil was used. The goal was to sustain illumination rather than inflict quick death. After the fire consumed the body, attendants collected the ashes and remnants for burial outside city limits. The remains were labeled as purified offerings, and the ground where the executions took place was sprinkled with salt to cleanse the space for future ceremonies. Every act followed strict ritual codes, ensuring that order was maintained even in death. Yoshinori justified the practice as a form of public education. He claimed that it allowed society to see the consequences of moral weakness in a visible, unforgettable way. His advisors argued that fear produced harmony, and that by turning sinners into light, the shogunate could transform crime into virtue. The punishment became an annual spectacle in Edo's summer festivals. Families attended, merchants sold food nearby, and artists sketched the scenes for moral pamphlets distributed later. The line between justice and entertainment grew increasingly blurred. The condemned were no longer individuals, but instruments of moral theater. Foreign visitors who managed to enter Japan under special permission recorded brief observations of these rituals. One Dutch trader noted that the events were conducted with a calm discipline he had never seen in European executions. To him, the silence of the crowd was more unsettling than the flames themselves. As the years passed, the lantern men became both a warning and a tradition. Some citizens began lighting extra lanterns during the festival as offerings for the souls of the condemned. Others whispered that the spirits of those burned lingered near the streets, drawn to the very lights that once consumed them. The shogunate discouraged such superstition, but tolerated the practice as long as it reinforced obedience. Over time, regions beyond Edo began adopting the ritual in smaller forms. Local magistrates organized night parades featuring convicted thieves carrying oil lamps, symbolically marking them as walking lights of repentance. Though less extreme than Yoshinori's original design, these events carried the same message. Visibility equaled virtue, and concealment invited punishment. Despite its cruelty, the ritual reflected broader beliefs of the era. Fire was viewed as both destructive and sacred, capable of cleansing moral pollution. By linking punishment to purification, Yoshinori blurred the distinction between law and religion. This fusion gave his rule an aura of divine legitimacy that few dared to challenge openly. The lantern men also reinforced class boundaries. Samurai and nobles rarely faced such punishment, no matter their crimes. The spectacle was reserved for commoners, reflecting the social hierarchy that underpinned Tokugawa governance. The suffering of the lower classes served as a moral display for the elite. The philosophical foundation of the ritual came from a combination of Buddhist and Shinto ideas. Buddhist priests interpreted it as karmic cleansing, while Shinto adherents saw it as restoring harmony between humans and the divine order. The shogunate used both interpretations to justify the practice publicly. As the system continued, scholars within the court began to question its moral implications. Some argued that turning execution into entertainment weakened its educational purpose. Others feared that excessive cruelty could erode respect for the government. Yoshinori ignored these concerns, believing that the strength of the state depended on its ability to inspire fear. The punishment achieved its intended effect in the short term. Crime rates within the major cities declined, and citizens became increasingly cautious about public behavior. Yet beneath the surface, unease grew. The sight of human lanterns left lasting psychological scars on the population, embedding fear deeply into everyday life. By the final decade of Yoshinori's reign, the Lantern Men ritual had become synonymous with his name. Officials continued to stage the ceremony each year, presenting it as proof of moral renewal. The shogunate's control appeared absolute, and Yoshinori's belief that illumination could purify the nation seemed fulfilled. However, the silent discomfort among scholars and townspeople hinted at change to come. The light that once symbolized moral clarity was beginning to cast darker shadows across the empire. What began as a symbol of repentance was slowly transforming into a mark of tyranny that would define the legacy of Tokugawa Yoshinori for generations. In the final years of Tokugawa Yoshinori's rule, the brilliance that once symbolized order began to reveal the cracks within his governance. The Lantern Men ritual, initially celebrated as a moral purification, had turned into a grim reminder of fear and control. Citizens obeyed the law, but their silence no longer reflected respect. It reflected exhaustion. Reports of unrest began to reach Edo's magistrates. Villagers in distant provinces refused to attend the lantern festivals, claiming the ceremonies brought misfortune. Monks who once cooperated with the shogunate started questioning the righteousness of the fire rituals, suggesting that true repentance could not come from suffering imposed by others. Yoshinori dismissed such criticism as weakness. He ordered more public displays of punishment, believing that disobedience stemmed from leniency, yet even his closest advisors noticed a change in him. The ruler who once valued discipline through reason had grown isolated and distrustful. He saw discontent as betrayal and sought loyalty through constant surveillance. The oil merchants who supplied the executions began facing shortages due to declining trade and drought. Some saw this as a divine sign that the gods had rejected the ritual. Rumors spread that the smoke from the burning condemned had angered ancestral spirits. Officials tried to suppress these beliefs, but fear of divine retribution deepened among the population. Foreign observers later noted that Yoshinori's empire was strong in structure, but fragile in spirit. The rigid order that had held society together began to stifle innovation and trust. Artisans avoided creating lanterns resembling human figures, and poets quietly replaced themes of illumination with darkness in their verses. The symbol of light had lost its virtue. When a great fire broke out in Edo during a midsummer festival, destroying hundreds of homes, many citizens viewed it as karmic punishment for the lantern men rituals. Priests urged the shogun to end the practice, warning that the boundary between sacred flame and destructive fire had been crossed. Yoshinori resisted, but could not ignore the growing dissent. In a final attempt to reaffirm his authority, he ordered one last execution by fire at the height of summer. Few citizens attended. The chants of the priests were faint, and even his officers avoided meeting his eyes. The ritual that once represented unity now stood as a symbol of isolation. Within a year, illness and old age overtook Yoshinori. His successors quietly discontinued the lantern men punishment, replacing it with less visible forms of justice.